afternoon. Let's all shout back. I can really hear the joy in this room and all of the lively conversations, and I hate to interrupt them, but I have so much to share, as do my colleagues. So I want to welcome you. Hope you can find your seats. And I want to thank you for joining us today as we gather to celebrate the life and career of James Sidney Jackson. Yes. Exactly. I am Kate Cagney, the director of the Institute for Social Research. Today's program underscores James's far-reaching influence, extending across and beyond academia. The impact of his work was felt locally, nationally, and internationally, and that's represented in the program that you'll see today. As a champion of interdisciplinary collaboration, James's influence extended to numerous areas of scholarship and to the role of scholarship in sports. As a leader, he shaped the university, and his legacy lives on through his research and those he mentored. And I'm going to cite Sandy Danziger, who came over at lunch today and chatted with Rich and with me and suggested that all of those who were mentored by James Jackson please stand up. Was an excellent suggestion, a signal of collaboration, and I think a powerful showing of all of those lives that he shaped. So our intent today is to capture those many worlds in which James operated and had influence, and you'll see that in the structure of the center is all the different kinds of communities in which he engaged. James was the Daniel Katz Distinguished University Professor of Psychology, the director of the Research Center for Group Dynamics from 1996 to 2005, and the director of the Institute for Social Research from 2005 to 2015. Notably, he led the National Survey of Black Americans and founded the Program for Research on Black Americans. His contributions earned him numerous distinctions, including election to the National Academy of Medicine and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. James shared his distinctive voice with all of us in so many ways, and his contributions really do defy easy categorization. His leadership and visionary thinking shaped the future of ISR, evident in the expansion of our facilities, which we celebrated earlier today, and his dedication to next generation initiatives, which we'll hear more about later. During a visit to Ann Arbor years ago, I had the pleasure of spending time with James. I had read so much of his work, and I was standing when all of you stood, but I also saw him as a mentor, so I want to make sure you include me in the group. And I used his models and methods to inform my dissertation. His kindness and gracious demeanor left a strong impression on me, and indeed, his science and sociability meant that he was the only University of Michigan scholar, at least to our knowledge, in history, whose local seminar here required a fire marshal to control the crowd. And I had friends who recounted the story to me that said they were trying to get in the room, no chance to be able to hear James Jackson. Among James's many gifts was his ability to build and maintain community, a theme I believe beautifully captured in Irish poet and Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney's poem Scaffolding. I tend to turn to Irish poets in time of need, and I did need some guidance here on how best to capture what James meant to this community. And I'll just say that earlier today, Ariana and Kendra, James's daughters, were telling me about their family trip to Ireland in 2018, and I actually saw a great video of your daughter gambling with James, right, in Ireland, and some beautiful photographs. So I feel like this is particularly fitting. So let me read Scaffolding. Masons, when they start upon a building, are careful to test out the scaffolding. Make sure that planks won't slip at busy points. Secure all ladders, tighten bolted joints. And yet all this comes down when the job's done, showing off walls of sure and solid stone. So if, my dear, there sometimes seem to be old bridges breaking between you and me. Never fear. We may let the scaffolds fall, confident that we have built our wall. James was a builder of many communities, and I would say a mason, and we're here to celebrate him and his impact. That is why today's program focuses on the many worlds in which he provided that scaffolding. He created a foundation that continues to allow for growth and discovery, and I will say that ISR is forever thankful for all that he brought to our community. But on those thank yous, I want to thank those who made this event possible today. Deborah Robinson. Deborah, please stand. Please stand. She led the planning of this event from the very beginning, and her leadership created the program and brought together the speakers that we'll enjoy. Each of the speakers on the program has volunteered their time to share memories and lessons from their experience with James. We thank so many, too, for traveling to spend this time with us. I want to thank members of the ISR staff who supported this event, in particular our events manager, Anna Massey, and communications director, Catherine Pearson. I also want to thank my colleague and RCGD director, Rich Gonzalez, who we'll hear from soon, for helping to shape this day. We are also grateful for the support of the donors to the James Jackson Emerging Scholars Fund, which contributes to the continued growth and development of up-and-coming research scientists. Finally, I want to thank Tony Antonucci, the Elizabeth Duvan Collegiate Professor of Psychology, Research Professor in ISR's Survey Research Center, and James's wife of more than 40 years. Tony is up front. Clearly, Tony's up front with me, along with their daughters, Ariana and Kendra, and their families. So we so appreciate them coming in from California to share this day. I also wanted to say that one pleasant outcome of planning this event has been my growing friendship with Tony. Over our many dinners, we have shared our scholarly interests, our family stories, our fashion sense, and also our experience of grief and what emerges. Grief will, of course, be present today, along with the joy and good humor we'll share. We acknowledge that our attachments can result in such grief, but we are so grateful to have forged them, and you are symbolic, right, of all that has emerged. I close by saying that we are so fortunate to be part of this scholarly enterprise and environment, where the interpersonal and the intellectual mix in a distinctly rich way. James and Tony's relationship exemplified what can grow from that intersection. And again, your presence today signals that too. Thank you for contributing to this community, making community, and the world that James built. Now, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Rich Gonzalez. Rich is the Amos N. Tversky Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Statistics, and he is the director of the Research Center for Group Dynamics. Welcome, Rich.
I want to welcome everyone to today's symposium celebrating the life of James Jackson. Everyone here who knew James has stories to tell of how James influenced their research, their career, their lives, their work. A useful metric of one's impact is the stories that people tell, the stories that live after our paths take us to different jobs in faraway places. I've had the honor to listen to many of your stories about James. My own stories involve spending hours in his office discussing research ideas, usually involving details about the analysis plan on a grant proposal. Those discussions with James were always exciting. He would make the minutia of sampling strategies and statistical tests seem as they were central to answering this, the most important research question that NIH or NSF has ever seen. And getting these details right would pave the way to the most important scientific discovery. James had a remarkable ability to make you feel like your ideas truly mattered, that your work was important, and that you as a person were valued. These qualities served him well in his research life, but they also are the same qualities that made him an effective mentor and administrator. As a mentor and administrator, James's wisdom was matched only by his patience. His guidance was never prescriptive, but rather he provided a gentle nudge in the right direction. He also wasn't shy. Didn't shy away from calling you out if that was necessary. He saw potential in each of us and believed in our ability to make meaningful contributions to the team. He accomplished this in his own unique style. As many of us know, he was not one to dole out compliments very easily. Today we will hear stories about James's influence across multiple spheres of academia. We will hear about the groundbreaking research he conducted, his administrative accomplishments, the friendships he nurtured, the wisdom he imparted, and the stories that we created together. I look forward to hearing your stories. So thank you. I'm now going to introduce Tabby Chavez, who's going to say a few more words in our introductory session.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm deeply honored to be here today, and I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity to commemorate the extraordinary life and legacy of Dr. James S. Jackson. I extend my sincerest thanks to everyone at ISR for their exceptional work in organizing the symposium. The opportunity to be among such a distinguished group of scholars and leaders and friends at this important event is truly humbling. James, or Dr. Jackson's career, was a testament to his deep commitment to diversity in research, teaching, leadership, and mentorship. His extensive work explored the complex lives of ethnically diverse Black populations, spanning social, political, economic, and health realms. James was monumentally influential in both psychology and in a wide range of social science and health science fields due to his groundbreaking interdisciplinary approaches to studying and documenting race, racism, and health processes. James's leadership of the Program for Research on Black Americans, fictionally known as PRBA, grew from the National Survey of Black Americans, NSBA, which was the first nationally representative sample and study of Black households. It was groundbreaking in advancing research and knowledge around Black populations' health and mental and well-being. As the founding director of PRBA, he directly mentored a wide array of graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and junior faculty. And through the unique and rich data resources of NSBA, these developing scholars were afforded opportunities to conduct and publish research on Black populations in ways that were not possible in other places, leading to a host of dissertations and many, many hundreds of peer-reviewed, high-impact publications. James's work ensured a lasting impact on the field through the research he produced and through his creation of new pathways for future generations to explore the health and well-being of diverse ethnic groups. In fact, James's 40-plus years of mentorship profoundly influenced the careers of intergenerational groups of scholars and leaders, from students to faculty and leader peers. If you traced his scholarly and leadership genealogy, you would find many dozens of former mentees and collaborators who've gone on to become leaders and change makers in their own rights in academic, research, public spaces, and other practice spaces, nationally and internationally, and who are now mentoring new generations of scholars and change makers. Some of them are here today, as evidenced by Kate's exercise. As Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, and professor of education and psychology here at Michigan, I have a personal and deep connection to the impact of James's work. And I greatly appreciate Kate's and Rich's insights that underscore why we're gathered here today, to honor an internationally acclaimed scholar, pioneer, and innovator whose career has been dedicated to creating socially significant science. In recognition of his remarkable career and contributions, in 2017, James was the first recipient of the University of Michigan's Distinguished Diversity Scholarship Career Award, awarded by the Office of the Provost in collaboration with the National Center for Institutional Diversity, of which I was director at the time. It was the first university-wide award at U of M, specifically focused on transformative scholarly impacts related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The creation of this award reflected a critical goal and action in our campus's DEI strategic plan: to elevate, recognize, and honor excellence in DEI work, and in this case, innovation and impacts through research and scholarship. That same year, the award was aptly renamed the James S. Jackson Distinguished Career Award for Diversity Scholarship. Those of you who are here today, doing this was a no-brainer. James's life and career epitomize the type of intellectual curiosity, commitment, and accomplishment that we envisioned when the award was founded. This award is now presented biennially by the provost and recognizes a senior faculty member on our campus who has made transformative contributions to understandings of DEI topics through their research, scholarship, or creative endeavors, that have an outstanding record in teaching and mentoring, and whose work has focused on issues of importance to minoritized and marginalized communities. The goals of the award exemplify the life and work of James. The goals are to support the production of a robust body of knowledge and teaching in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which include addressing disparities in our society, to elevate these research foci nationally and internationally, to provide important recognition to scholars conducting work in areas that have been historically undervalued or under-recognized in their fields and disciplines, and to create a permanent tribute to those who have made significant scholarly contributions in areas of diversity, addressing inequality, and advancing justice throughout their careers. Sounds like James, right? Since James's awarding in 2017, the award has recognized exceptional individuals like Patricia Gurin, the Nancy Cantor Distinguished University Professor Emerita of Psychology and Women's Studies, honored in 2019, whose scholarship provided foundational empirical evidence for the value of diversity in higher ed, and was a university's key expert witness when race-conscious admissions policies were being challenged in the federal courts in the late 90s and early 2000s. In 2021, the award was presented to Arlene Geronimus, Professor of Health Behavior and Health Education in the School of Public Health, a research professor also at the Population Studies Center in ISR. Dr. Geronimus is renowned for her research on the concept she termed weathering, describing and demonstrating the physical impacts of systemic and structural and cultural oppression. And the 2023 recipient of the award is Robert Sellers, the Charles D. Moody Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Education. Dr. Sellers has made significant contributions through his work on the life experiences of African Americans, and his research has provided new theoretical perspectives and advanced empirical methods in studying race and identity processes. All of these awardees have been nurtured and supported and affirmed directly and indirectly by James Jackson. They all exemplify the spirit of his award and of him and of his life itself. All have significantly contributed to our understandings of DEI issues and have applied their research in ways that have helped address local, national, and global communities. Having been a faculty member at U of M for nearly 25 years, and as the director of the National Center for Institutional Diversity when the award was established, I am proud to see U of M recognize and celebrate the transformative work of James Jackson, as well as diversity scholars whose contributions have impacted our university and society. I also will add, from the perspective of my current role, that recognizing the importance of the legacy of James's work is increasingly important amidst this current national climate. Scholars, especially those studying race and diversity, are facing pressures from sociopolitical forces, labeling the work as simply ideological or questioning its academic rigor or intellectual usefulness. We're witnessing a new wave of tactics that have historically created barriers and hindered progress for communities of color, manifesting as attacks on educational systems and academic freedom, among other tactics. It is ironic that as we celebrate James Jackson, who helped lead the formation of U of M's Center, now Department of Afro-American and African Studies, that states across our nation are attempting to legislate and limit the teaching and knowledge production in this area. James's legacy is here, it's important, and the work and the innovation and the fight that he pursued is still critically important today. The current context underscores the significance of gatherings like this and the importance of recognition such as the James Jackson Award. This work not only celebrates and encourages diversity scholarship, but it signals our commitment to advancing the work for the good of society. With many in the audience having traveled afar to join us, your collective presence and participation in the work that you're doing is more vital than ever. And finally, I just want to say that I'm proud to honor James as a colleague and a friend. Over the course of my career at U of M, which I began in 1998 as an assistant professor, despite James being literally the most busy person that I have ever met, he was consistently generous and available with his support, his affirmation, and his encouragement to me, just as he was with so many of you. Thank you again for being here today, and I'm looking forward to a terrific symposium. Thank you.
Let's now turn to our first session, and I'm very pleased to introduce Priti Shah, who is the Psychology Department Chair and Arthur F. Thurnow Professor of Psychology at the University of Michigan. She will be moderating our session. Priti? It's an honor to be able to moderate this session focusing on James Jackson's national and international impact with this distinguished set of speakers who I will introduce momentarily. I'd like to take a second, though, and start off this session talking about his local impact on the Department of Psychology, where Professor Jackson first joined the university as an assistant professor in social psychology in 1971. He was promoted to full professor in 1986 and then named the Daniel Katz Distinguished University Professor of Psychology in 1995. Though in the latter part of his career, Professor Jackson was director of ISR and busy with all sorts of leadership and scholarly endeavors, he continued to work closely with the faculty and graduate students in psychology, and he was especially known for his compassionate, hands-on mentorship of students and junior faculty. I spoke with Denise Sekakwetewa, another social psychology faculty member, who, as an assistant professor, shared a lab meeting with James. And she painted a vivid picture of his lab meetings, which often took place in the evenings around the dinner table, with food, drink, and stimulating conversations about research. The students in his lab felt very much part of the community. He was sensitive to the broad range of needs of his mentees, many of whom were first-generation college students, and kindly focused on professional development, broadly speaking, even talking about how to network at a conference, what to do at a fancy reception, and which wine glasses go with which kinds of wine. Despite his status and fame, he always managed to make time for them, even if that meant meeting on a Saturday afternoon to help a junior colleague revise a grant proposal. I remember first meeting James at his home when I myself was an assistant professor and thinking that he and Tony had created in their home the ultimate academic environment. Rooms filled with animated conversations about science and politics and friendship. Perhaps the last time I saw him speak was when he gave an overview of his research at the psychology department banquet. And I remember thinking he was the quintessential scholar who had contributed an immense body of impactful work, and we were so lucky to have him as a colleague in psychology. We truly miss his presence. Of course, James' impact was felt way beyond our department.
even though I'd like to take ownership. I am pleased to introduce the panel who will discuss his impact both nationally and internationally. Our speakers, our first speaker will be Richard J. Hodes, Director of the National Institute on Aging and at the National Institutes of Health. Oh, update. Not our first video. Yeah, oh yes. He will start us off with the video message.
Hodes, Director of the National Institute on Aging at the National Institutes of Health. It is my privilege to participate in this celebration of the life and legacy of James Jackson. James Jackson was an exceptional researcher who initiated the area of aging research that paid attention to diverse populations and studies of Black Americans growing up in this country at a level that had never been studied before, and has given rise to what is currently a very vibrant field of health disparities and diversity as we attempt to understand the best approaches to creating the best life for all Americans. As a reflection of his expertise and the respect in which he was held, James served many advisory positions at NIA. He was on the National Advisory Council on Aging and on its board of scientific counselors. In all these areas, we respected his knowledge and also his ability to critique in a creative way that made the product better for his participation. In addition to being an exceptional scientist, James Jackson was an extraordinary human being. I had the good fortune to work with him over many years, and I think I never met a better human being. James had the ability to interact with people, to criticize when necessary, but always to do so with the goal of coming to the best possible outcome. His legacy, therefore, is not only his science, but the students he trained, the people he mentored, and all those of us who had the opportunity to work with him, and hopefully came away from it as better people, reflecting a bit in the glory of the person that is James Jackson. James, we appreciate what we've had from you and what you've left behind with us, and take it as your legacy to continue your work and its spirit. Thank you, James.
From the original?
That's good.
Gotcha.
Okay, I'd like to invite the rest of the panel to come up at this time. They are France Cordova, who is the former director of the National Science Foundation, Sheldon Danziger, the president of the Russell Sage Foundation and distinguished university professor of public policy, emeritus at the University of Michigan, Anderson J. Franklin, the Honorable David S. Nelson Professor, Chair Emeritus, School of Education and Human Development at Boston College, and James Nazrou, Professor of Sociology at the University of Manchester. So our next speaker is France Cordova. Please welcome Dr. Cordova.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. I've lost a little bit of voice. I think I left it on the tarmac in Atlanta Airport, where we were held over for quite a while yesterday. So I want to thank the organizers of this symposium for the privilege of sharing some thoughts about James Jackson from the perspective of a board that he relished serving on. And that board is the National Science Board. I want to tell you first just a little bit about this board. It was established by an act of Congress in 1950 upon the founding of the National Science Foundation, an independent government agency. The board serves as the policy arm of the National Science Foundation. It's also an independent policy advisory board to the President of the United States, to Congress, on the subjects of science and engineering research and science education. And every member of the board is appointed by the president. So James joined the National Science Board in August of 2014, serving until his passing in September 2020. He almost exactly overlapped my tenure as the 14th director of the National Science Foundation. As NSF's director, I was an ex officio member of the board, and I had served on the board for 6 years before I became director. So there's a very, very close coupling between the National Science Foundation, which hopefully has funded many of you in this room, and the National Science Board, our policy arm. For the National Science Board, or NSB as I'll refer to it, James was chair of the Committee on External Engagement and the chair of the ad hoc committee for one of the nominating classes. He was also a member of many of the board committees, including the Executive Committee, the Committee on Science and Engineering Indicators. So I think some of you, especially at the Institute for Social Science Research, are familiar with the 1,000-page document that's turned out every couple of years called the Indicators. And he was on the Committee on Awards and Facilities. NSF has lots of facilities, including 3 in Antarctica that I'll mention. The Committee on Strategy and Budget, the Committee on Facilities, and the Task Force on the Skilled Technical Workforce, and that's where what he really enjoyed and shown. He embarked on a nationwide listening tour to help the National Science Board understand how it could more effectively serve diverse parts of our country. In all of these activities, James brought his deep wisdom and incredible energy. Everyone here who knows him, worked with him, can testify that he brought that wisdom and energy to any project with which he was involved. You may not know that the National Science Board has a video archive, and I shared that with the organizers of this conference. You can see his mind at work in many of these videos. In one, he describes his service to the NSB. He loved how the NSB gave him a platform to weigh in on what he called heady stuff, important matters dealing with the government, with the office of the President of the United States. In the video, he described the experience as absolutely wonderful and extolled the beauty of supporting basic science, because that's what NSF does, saying that the imperative was to fund people, and then let's see what happens. His own basic research did so much for the nation, helping people understand more about the Black experience and other vitally important topics, and we'll hear more about that in this symposium. James served on the National Science Board with leading scientists from around the country, and so many of them have incredible things to say about the experience working with him. So I asked them to weigh in on James and their experiences with him. So I want to give you just a few examples. So the first example is Maria Zuber, who's a geophysicist from MIT, and she was for a long time the vice president for research of MIT, and she currently co-chairs President Biden's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. She chaired the NSB for 2 years during James' service on the board and had this to say about him. One of the many wonderful aspects of serving on the National Science Board was interacting with and getting to know distinguished scientific leaders from other fields. When I think about the fact that I probably would not have gotten to know James had we not overlapped on the NSB, I realized I would have missed an incredibly enriching part of my life. When I became chair of the board, I asked James to lead our activities in external engagement. This mainly focused on bridging and communicating with Congress. And I don't know if you remember what it was like doing that a few years ago. I mean, it's still a real challenge, but especially with the social sciences and the appreciation of the social sciences. And so that's why she selected James to really carry that message forward to Congress. It was a crucial, complicated engagement. James was at that same time dedicated, adept, and effective in keeping the lines of communication open and conveying reliable and objective information about NSF to policymakers. At a time when social sciences were under siege by some in Congress who didn't value the social sciences, James was, by example and through preparation, the most effective advocate that one could imagine. During that time, James also served on the NSB's executive committee and contributed meaningfully and in good spirit to the decision-making and the direction of the board. He was a leader among leaders and a treasured colleague. And then she goes on to say, on a personal note, one thing about James really surprised me. One afternoon at a board meeting, I mentioned I was heading into DC and got NHL Capitals tickets and was going to go to the game with my son. James perked up and asked who they were playing. He then gave me a pregame rundown, not only on who the players were and which was the better team, but who was injured and how the teams matched up. I learned that he was a dedicated Detroit Red Wings fan, not something I would have guessed about an eminent professor. After that, when James and I talked, we of course focused on the mission of NSF. I think she has to say that. But we often found time for a bit of hockey talk. It was one of so many special things about James. Anila Sargent is an astronomer from Caltech who also served with James, and she was head for some time of Caltech Student Affairs. She was vice president for their Student Affairs office. About him, she noted that, quote, James was always a helpful and thoughtful contributor to NSB on a wide range of topics. The confidence he displayed as a member of the executive committee was particularly helpful to all of us. Victor McCrary is a chemist, vice president for research at the District of Columbia, a powerful advocate for diversity in STEM, and current vice chair of the NSB. His memories of James are particularly fond. Recently, he said, my reflection of James was very touching. At one of my first board meetings, I shared with him, wow, I can't believe I'm on this board with all of these wonderful and brilliant minds. And he replied, that's why we selected you. So never have any doubts. I needed that token of confidence. The current director of the National Science Foundation, Setha Raman Panchanathan, whom some of you know as Panch, served with James on the NSB and also holds James in very high regard. He said that James was truly an inspiration for all of us on the board. I admired his keen intellect and was amazed by his ability to navigate complexities by his simple, intellectually spirited and collaborative approach. He exuded calmness when he spoke, people listened. While he may be a man of few words, every one of those words mattered and were effective. I cherished his friendship. He was an implicit member by how he conducted himself. And so in that sense, all of us would stand when we were asked to stand as mentees. A highlight of my tenure, Panch says, was the trip to Antarctica, which was made even more special by traveling with James. Vince Cerf is widely recognized as the father of the internet. He also served with James on the National Science Board. When asked to describe that experience, he said, my recollections of James on the NSB stem from his pointed and thoughtful interventions, self-deprecating sense of humor, and insights into the Black psyche. I found him to be a trusted colleague on the NSB who could be relied upon to speak plainly and with passion. He left the world and our NSB better off for his presence. And then John Vesey was the executive director of the board for all the time that James was on the board, and he had a lot of positive things to say about him. One was about a trip they took to Macomb Community College. There, Vesey learned, quote, that James' first job out of high school, I think in the mid-50s, was on a Ford assembly line in downtown Detroit. He connected so easily with folks at that automotive-centered program 50 years later. And he told another story about James' integrity. I sensed that he had some, quote, found time in the period between when he first had cancer treatment and when it returned. He had a couple of years in which, while physically recovering, seemed to have found a centered point, a peace. He rejoined NSB actively. He was always such a kind, gentle, and generous person in spite of the challenges he overcame in life. But in this period, he approached something beatific, applying a lifetime of understanding people to himself and those around him, the embodiment of grace. And finally, on his passing, the chair and vice chair of the National Science Board, Ellen Ochoa, and Victor McCreary published this tribute online on behalf of the National Science Board. We're deeply saddened by the loss of our friend and former National Science Board colleague, James Jackson, who passed away on September 1st after a long and courageous battle with cancer. James was a scientific giant who in his long and rich career truly broke new ground at the frontiers of research in the social sciences, health, and medicine. His pioneering work to illuminate the impact of race and culture on the life experiences and development of Black Americans, including the founding of the Program for Research on Black Americans at the University of Michigan's Institute for Social Research, gave voice to a heretofore largely voiceless Black America. He was a mentor to many and was always passionate about supporting young researchers pursuing basic discovery science. It goes on to say, this tribute, James was a wonderful and wise contributor to NSB and to the National Science Foundation. As fellow board members, we greatly value the insight, deep intellect, and erudition he brought to all aspects of our work. As his colleagues and friends, we benefited from his generosity, humanity, and fierce grace. We are the better for him having been among us and less for the loss of his presence, but we know his legacy will live on through his tremendous scientific contributions and his profound influence on generations of scholars to come. In concluding, I'd like to add a final thought of my own. There's a joke that goes something like this: how many faculty does it require to change a light bulb? The faculty's answer: who says the light bulb needs to change? This occasion reveals a different answer to that question. When James Jackson is in the room, you have a wellspring of wisdom, a spark of innovation, and an agent of change. Unafraid to go where others had not gone, James ventured into a new understanding of so many vital topics, giving us clarity on the different life conditions of our diverse population. What we celebrate today is a man who broke new ground, whose deep intellect drove a new understanding of the humanness, the complexity of Black America, and so many other communities. He dove into previously underexplored parts of our history and culture and unearthed a treasure of insights and new approaches for scholars, insights that affect us all. He left us this lesson: change is hard, but it's necessary. Embrace it. He did all of this with incredibly good cheer, and in so doing, improved the quality of life for all of us. Thank you, James.
Thank you. And our next speaker is Sheldon Danziger from the Russell Sage Foundation, President.
I'm deeply honored to have the opportunity to reflect on the career, the remarkable career of James Jackson. I'm glad I'm going early because there's a consistency of comments that you'll hear in mine about James' accomplishments. And I think maybe it's like the light bulb, if this many academics can agree, it must be right. The last time I was in this room was in fall 2017 when James spoke, when he got what was then called the first Distinguished Diversity Scholar Award. James and Tony were visiting scholars at Russell Sage in 2016, 17, and in fact, I'm delighted there is a picture in the bottom of the brochure from their visit to the Russell Sage Foundation. And I noted that in addition to James and Tony in the photo, there are two Nobel Prize winners, Bob Solow and Dick Thaler. It was a remarkable year to get to spend with James and Tony at New York. I want to say something that reflects on my experience as president of the Russell Sage Foundation, but I should say I recuse myself when I know people from Michigan, because this is something about Michigan. In my job, I've gotten to know about social science researchers at literally hundreds of colleges and universities. But as you've heard, there's not only something about James, about what he did at ISR and what he did at Michigan, but also about Michigan in general, that has deep commitment to multidisciplinary social science research and a commitment to training the next generation of researchers, particularly researchers, first generation college students, students of color, and others who are underrepresented in the social sciences. And I suspect this theme about not only what James meant to Michigan and his students, but what Michigan, through his colleagues and former students, means to social science in the US is, again, to repeat the word, remarkable. I first met James in 1986. At the time, I was director of the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I had no idea that a few years later I would be James' colleague. At the time, James was a member of the Committee on the Status of Black Americans of the National Academy of Sciences, and it produced a very important report, A Common Destiny, Blacks in American Society. When I went back to prepare my remarks, I looked at the other members. I didn't research this, but my guess is that James was the youngest member. There were two psychologists, James Jackson and Tom Pettigrew, but others on this multidisciplinary NAS committee, and it may have been the first of many NAS committees that James served on, were B. Hamburg, William Julius Wilson, James Tobin, Charles Hamilton, John Hope Franklin, Eleanor Holmes Norton. I know James was a lot younger than all of them, but the point was, it was early in James' career, and he was already considered by NAS to be among the leaders in social science to do this important report. I also remember that James, when he found out that I was leading the Poverty Center at Madison, wanted to know why we weren't studying the NSBA. And again, those who know James would know that that would be what he would have to tell me. I actually knew about the NSBA because James, again, this is James, he was very generous in allowing one of my Wisconsin doctoral students to be an early user of NSBA. Edith Lewis is here. She's UM social work professor emerita, and she provided me with these notes. PRBA had just begun to analyze the data from the first national survey of Black Americans. James invited me to come, meet the PRBA team, and determine whether my research interest would support the goals of the overall project. I submitted a proposal for the team to review. He also invited me to come to ICPSR for the summer of '84 so that I could access the data. After meeting with James and Shirley Hatchett, the group accepted my dissertation proposal. Edie points out that the dissertation committee at Wisconsin and I had already approved it, but that wasn't good enough for James. He had to do it. So Edie reports I had ICPSR classes, attended both terms. The summer of '84 was filled with stat classes during the day and analyzing data all night. James also sat on my dissertation committee and had to approve the final version. So this indicates, again, the dedication to mentoring a new generation of African American scholars. That was a hallmark of his career, and which is the subject of a session later this afternoon. Since I'm supposed to talk about foundations, I want to focus on a conversation, one of many that I had when James and Tony were in residence at Russell Sage. And I remember reading a draft. This was a proposal for a postdoc program for underrepresented scholars at ISR to continue his legacy of research and training. And he thought, oh, Danziger, you're a foundation president. You'll know how to help me do this. So the good thing I can have to say about foundations and funding research and training is that I was delighted to see the establishment of the James S. Jackson Emerging Scholars Fund at ISR, which I suspect, I hope I'm wrong, but foundations most foundations no longer prioritize research and training. So when James and I talked about this, I said, well, it's pretty hard these days to get foundations focused on this issue. As I reviewed his CV for my remarks early in his career, James had many grants from the Ford and the Rockefeller Foundations, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and before I was there, the Russell Sage Foundation. Today, the Ford Foundation, a funder of the National Survey of Black Americans, and the Ford and Rockefeller Foundation, funders of the National Black Election Study, these are from James' CV, no longer support research programs like the ones James directed, or the doctoral and postdoctoral training program like the one I directed at Michigan for about 25 years. It's as if I said, well, I've been studying poverty and inequality for a long time, so poverty and inequality are high, so it must be time to give up and move on. But that's what the Ford Foundation recently did. It no longer plays the long game that James played. It ended its 30-year support for minority dissertation and postdoctoral fellowships, saying that after all their funding and all these years, there were still too few tenured scholars of color. They didn't ask me, but if they had, I would have said, gee, we teach first-year doctoral students something about asking the counterfactual question. How many of today's tenured scholars of color would have gotten tenure without being supported by the Ford Foundation? Many of the scholars I know of color were recipients of that. Similarly, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation ended the Skills Clinical Scholars Program for medical doctors, the Health Policy Program, and the Health Society Program for social scientists. All three programs operated very successfully when I was at Michigan. Again, why did they do this? I think they did it because they no longer want to play the long game. It may have something to do with the society we live in. It's a criticism of corporations that they're always worried about the quarterly profit reports. They want fast results. They fund advocacy programs and social change organizations. I have no problem with emphasizing social change. Indeed, James did research and changed the next generation of scholars to improve the social, political, health, and living conditions of Black Americans. But an exclusive focus on the short term and the rejection of the long game is problematic. I'll give you an example from my own experience at Russell Sage. Our problem is we are very small. We have about 1/20 of the funds of the larger foundations like Mellon and Ford and Rockefeller and Gates. At Russell Sage, we established a small grants program for early career scholars who were underrepresented in the social sciences or who teach at under-resourced universities and who are not likely to be funded in the foundation's very competitive regular research programs. A foundation officer recently asked my goals for the program. I quickly responded. 6 years after these scholars get their first Russell Sage grant, I expect that they will be more likely to be tenured than the applicants who made it to the review stage but were not funded. The person looked at me like, what? I thought Russell Sage was concerned about reducing poverty and inequality in the United States. What's that got to do with it? And then they said, you should be funding people like Raj Chetty. They really said that. And I said, Raj Chetty has had $100 million over the last 10 years. I'm giving people their first grants. So James didn't get a foundation to fund the program, but ISR is doing that, and I think that's important. And James played the long game for his entire career. His many publications, his dedicated service, his extensive mentorship have made sure that many others continue his path-breaking vision. And I use a quote I took from the video clip on the website. His vision was to study, quote, the real imperatives and needs of the African American community that have been overlooked by the social science research that had been done before. This is basically what James told me when I met him in 1986, and I'm proud to have been his colleague and friend for more than 30 years. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Anderson J. Franklin from Boston College.
I want to thank the conveners of this symposium for inviting me to share some reflections on James' involvement with the American Psychological Association, APA, and Association of Black Psychologists, ABPSI. As we all know, and I have experience, representing James's involvement in anything is a challenge, given all that he did. Our lives overlapped with involvement in APA and with ABPSI, which is short for American Association of Black Psychologists. These organizations represent one sector of James's career, as the various speakers here today illustrate his scope of contributions. So to fulfill this request of me today, I had to reflect upon how often did James and I met at APA and ABPSI conventions and governance meetings over the years. Moreover, to consider how much of the discourse generated by these activities were linked to his overall visioning, activism, and commitment to social change. There were a lot of generative years. James and I met in 1970, 1971 at APA and ABPSI conventions. We were both early career psychologists. James was finishing his doctoral degree, and I had finished my doctorate several years earlier. We both were getting to know each other. I had just returned to the country after several expatriate years living in Nigeria. At the time that I met James, he was president of the Black Students Psychological Association, which was at that time independent of the Association of Black Psychologists. The Association of Black Psychologists was founded in 1968. The organizational independence of both ABPSI and what we know as BSPA, and the subsequent discussions of combining membership and priorities of both professionals and students at that time was central to both associations' evolution of structure and function as an ethnic psychology professional organization. James was in the middle of that discourse, given his leadership roles. James was elected president of the Association of Black Psychologists for the 1972-73 years. I had helped at that time found the New York Association of Black Psychologists and was then president of the New York Association of Black Psychologists. We both were immersed in AB Psi and conflicted about APA these early days of our careers. We were confronting APA about the importance of the psychology of the lived experience of African Americans and throughout the African diaspora. How to remedy that reality was the source of many meetings within both associations. And let me say it was filled with passionate and heated discussions. It was not just APA as a professional association that was the issue, but what it represented. Psychology as a discipline and profession at that time had little appropriate scholarly content about the lived experiences of Black Americans. And what it did have misrepresented us, was often pejorative and racist, serving discriminatory, harmful practices and policies for us and our communities. I cannot overstate that there were very few Black psychologists with earned doctorates, master's, or even undergraduate degrees for that matter, in the 1960s and 1970s. As those few of us were part of AB Psi, the Black Student Psych Association, and even APA, felt that we had to confront and evolve psychology as a discipline and profession and policy maker. We had to more appropriately represent the lived and cultural experiences of Black people and our development in theory, research, practice, and policy making. Training as Black psychologists was key concern for us. The magnitude of this enterprise was immense, as you can imagine, and we were also very much still immersed in the civil rights movement, which was still a very much powerful influence at that time in the country. Now, out of this period, evolved James Jackson, the visionary, as well as the embryonic formation of the Program for Research on Black Americans. Understanding this period in James' life contextualizes his vision, drive, goal setting, and achievements throughout his career. He operated on all fronts, evolving theory, research, practice, and policy making. And his immersion in the governance and activities of AB Psi and APA were only several of many organizations he impacted to bring about systemic changes. Another formative event that nurtured and shaped our trajectory was in 1975, when two Black psychologists, Wade Boykin and Frank Yates, both alumni, and Frank ultimately became faculty here at Michigan, established an empirical conference on research in Black psychology. Now, the vision and goals of this particular conference was to affirm and elevate empirical research's importance to Black psychology. We both learned about this initiative, James and I, and James offered to host the first meeting at the University of Michigan. James' embrace of the empirical conference on research in Black psychology was another impetus to his vision to develop a space where Black psychologists, students, and interdisciplinary scholars could talk about and evolve their thinking and research about Black people. It helped further his development of the Program of Research on Black Americans. Positioning empirical research of Black psychology, or in general, psychological research rooted in the African diaspora, was full of challenges and demands, both within AB Psi and APA. And James, as we all did, struggled with how to achieve this goal. Part of James's vision to alter psychology's content to be more inclusive of culturally appropriate scholarship about and for African Americans, as well as training, was cultivated by his various memberships in governance boards and committees within APA. James was committed to institutionalizing Black scholarship, as well as bringing about systemic changes. So here are a few of James's membership within APA, a few, all right? The Committee on Mental Health Research, the Finance Committee, Task Force on Training in Psychology, Policy and Planning Board, to name a few. However, for me, a memorable time for us both was in 2001 when we both were members of the 6 official delegates from APA to the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa. At that time, James was chair of the APA Committee on International Relations in Psychology, or SIRP. I was president of the APA Division Society for the Psychological Study of Ethnic Minority Issues. James and I were roommates for 2 weeks. That's another story. The important thing I will share is how James worked tirelessly, like all of us, during and after the World Conference to get precise wording that urged the recognition of mental health determinants and outcomes of racism into the official U.S. Declaration and Program of Action, and therefore ratified by all the nation states. James' energy was tirelessly a part of that success. So James, needless to say, membership in these associations were only one of many. James was the epitome of an energizer bunny, always visioning, developing, and implementing. He and I were often each other's sounding boards for our career and personal life. We hung out in a lot of places across our lifelong friendship, visioning and strategizing. This includes the memorable time he convinced me to fly home from my project in Africa through Paris, where he was working that summer. We ended up at a cafe on the Champs-Élysées sipping wine and talking. Or another time when he convinced me to come join him at the Russell Sage holiday party, great holiday party. After finishing my consultations in New York City, he and Tony were, visiting scholars there. Crashing the party wasn't nothing new for us. However, it was after that holiday party that is most memorable and special for me, because the two of us hung out afterwards sipping wine at a bar in a small French cafe in the neighborhood, just the two of us. We talked for hours about our careers, personal life, the future, and it was not long after that James told me of his diagnosis. When I think about that moment in time and the years for James before and after, I marvel at his visioning, his strength, his resilience, optimism, and incredible capacity for living life. And I think to myself, I was truly blessed to have my friend and brother James Jackson and Tony in my life.
And the last speaker of our session is James Nazru from the University of Manchester.
As you all know, I'm going to show some slides, but you saw them earlier.
Control, Alt, Delete. Where's our tech guy? Okay.
But
It's Control, Alt, Delete.
we've been knocked out.
Oh, then we need a code.
Well, while we're waiting, I can say a couple of things. Slides, of course, are not really that important, and I'm breaking with tradition in putting some slides up. But I was going to use them just to illustrate some things that James and I did together. I start by saying, I think I am going to repeat what other people have said, as other speakers have said they were doing. Yeah, come on. Yeah.
Oh. I can't, I don't, this isn't my laptop, so. Whose laptop is it? This is Rackham AV. I can't log into that. I have to log into it.
The laptop doesn't belong to anybody, so I'll take it home with me because it's got my slides on it. I'll do without slides if we can't get it to work. So I was going to say what a fantastic honour and privilege it is to be here. When I was invited to come here, I immediately jumped at it. The opportunity to commemorate and celebrate James Jackson's contribution to our lives. I couldn't turn that down. So as you've seen, I'm a sociologist working in the UK, and I work on questions of inequality. And you might wonder how and why I got to meet James and then begin to work with James. I was in the kind of fortunate position in the late 1990s to work on the development of a study called the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, ELSA, which has parallels with the HRS. And so as we began to design that study with the support of the HRS teams, one of the things I did was to come to Michigan to talk with them and talk about the design of questionnaires and samples and stuff like that. And I just took the chance to email James and see whether he was in Michigan at the time and whether he would spare 15 minutes or so to chat with me. And he responded very quickly, very positively, as he does, and invited me to meet him, to meet his team, to go to his house, meet Tony and daughters. And I was really surprised, actually, because not only were they there, but his team were there as well. His postdocs, his doctoral students were there as well. And I thought, this is the way to live an academic life. But not just the fun, the investment in other people. What I'm going to do without my slides is to just say a little bit about how James intervened in the international field and do it from my experience. So I'm going to talk about the stuff I did with him. And it's all pretty light touch, but just to give you examples of how he operated from my perspective. So a couple of years after I'd made that first visit to Michigan and met James, and we'd begun talking about things that we potentially could do together, he was appointed to a panel set up by the National Academy, US National Academies, to look at older, racialized, ethnic minority people in the United States. And I was mid-career at the time, based at UCL in London, and I got an invitation to sit on this panel. Now you can think what a wonderful honour that was, recognition of my contribution. I hadn't really done very much on older people at that time, or older racialised groups at the time. But somehow I'd got this invitation. And then I looked at who was invited as well, and I recognised a couple of eminent people. And then I looked at the panel. And then I realised how and why I ended up being invited to this committee. Now, this was crucially important to me. It was crucially important to me for a number of reasons. One is it enabled us to establish this as a field of research in the UK, because I was being given the incentive to do that work. Nobody was doing it in the UK at the time. The other was, important for a CV if you're in the UK, is international presence. And international presence in the United States is even more important. Being invited to a National Academies committee to give evidence, to write a chapter, to contribute to the final report is amazing. A year after that, I was promoted to full professor. to be promoted to full professor in UCL is really quite difficult. It's not about me, this point is about James as well. It's really quite difficult. And again, you have to have this band of referees who write about you, of course, as elsewhere when you're getting tenure, and say how good you are, how important you are. In the UK, you have to have international referees. And if those international referees are eminent scholars from the United States, it makes a very big difference. And of course, my boss invited James to write such a recommendation for me, and led me, or contributed to my promotion to full professor at UCL at the time. The story is not just about me, of course, it's also about the other people. So I was going to put up a slide which showed some papers, just the titles and the abstract. And those papers were from my doctoral students. James came over to London and examined 2 of my doctoral students on 2 separate occasions. No, once to London, once to Manchester. But he didn't just examine them and support them through that examination process. He then started writing with them. Eminent professor from the United States comes and does the examination, and then not only does that, but continues to support and work with the, and continue to work with the students. The other thing that happened at the time, around that time, was that I began working with James on what I think is my favourite paper on my CV. And I'm going to be able to show you that now. So that was thank you. That works brilliantly. So the Green Book, of course, is the National Academy's book on critical perspectives on racial and ethnic differences in health in later life, which I really had the privilege of being involved in. The second two papers there are ones from my former doctoral students who were co-authored by James, their examiner, subsequently. The third paper there is my favourite paper, one of my favourite papers on my CV. It's quite an old paper, but it kind of centred both James's and my interests. James's interests on the experience of black populations and making those visible to the world. And my interest on inequalities in health and what was going on in the UK and trying to understand context in relation to this. And so we did a comparative study bringing together his data on the National Survey of American Life with some of the data that I had available in the UK to look at black populations in the 2 locations, and 3 black populations, Caribbean migrants in the UK and the US, and black Americans. And this is essentially what we found. And rather than look at the absolute levels, look at the relative levels. So the red bars compared with the blue bars, which are the 2 Caribbean populations compared with their white counterparts, and the big inequality faced by Caribbean people in the UK and not by Caribbean Americans. And then the yellow bar, which shows that black Americans also compared with the blue white American bar had some disadvantage. And here James began to kind of really hammer home the question of context and history. And how the racialization of black Americans and black Caribbeans in the UK context, that disadvantage had centuries of history attached to it. And when the black Caribbean diaspora came to the UK, they brought that with them to the UK, to their colonial rulers, their slave owners. And of course, the Caribbean diaspora to the US happened in very different contexts, and in the paper we begin to chart those contexts. And you can see the extended quote from the paper, which actually has a reference to a paper that you and Tony and James did at the end of it, which really pointed to the importance of civil rights in the American context, and the difference that potentially made to Caribbean migrants to the US. James also was willing to reach outside of his core interests, and so this is a Paris story as well, another story about a meeting in Paris, which reflects, of course, where he spent a lot of his time. So this began to happen in the period of the war, the beginnings of the War on Terror. And James brought Ken Coleman together with a bunch of academics in Europe to talk about the possibility of studying the experience of Muslim populations in different locations. So Arabs in Detroit, and then 3 locations in Europe, different Muslim populations. This is an incredibly brave thing to do, of course, in an era of the war on terror. It's not something that I think any of us in Europe would have imagined being able to do without Ken and James's support. And indeed, they helped finance this piece of work. But our initial meeting was in Paris. Our initial intention was to involve French academics in the work. But of course, in that context, in that time, it was impossible to do the work in France. So we just worked across 3 different capitals in Europe. I'm not going to say very much. There's a couple of papers that came from that work. I'm not going to say very much about what's on the slide, except again to point to a postdoc who worked with James and me on the previous paper that I've just described about the Black Diaspora paper, who got her first major grant off the back of this project, using the ideas that she developed with colleagues that James had brought together to get this major grant, which then sets you off on your career. I think is what you're saying about the importance of investing in mid-career people, early career people, who then get tenure, then become full professors, then begin to shape the academic agenda. I'll just give you a sense of findings from this as well, just to place the context of how we were thinking about Muslim populations in political and policy circles. These different people who were separated from the rest of our society had different views and beliefs from us. And what we found, I just emphasize 2 prominent findings here. One around national identity. And you see in the UK that the Bangladeshi population have very strong feelings of national identity because they were British citizens, whereas the Moroccan population in Madrid and the Turkish population in Berlin were not citizens, and so had low levels of national identity. But nevertheless felt like they belonged. Huge proportions of these populations, more than 80%, felt like they belonged where they were, despite the positioning of them as outsiders. And this led to a whole range of research that we conducted in the UK and across Europe to point to the contributions that Muslim populations were making to our societies, driven by James, a whole agenda driven by James, bringing us together to talk about these issues in a very difficult political context. This study I'll talk about briefly, but this is a study that led me to learn about leadership from James. So I didn't have a particular interest in child development, child psychology, but there was a real opportunity put together by major funders in the UK and the US to apply for this in a collaborative way, do some international comparative work. And James and I supported 2 teams to do that work, one from UCL and the other one from here. And I think by this time I had learned a lot from James, of course. And here I learned that there was an opportunity to support a relatively senior colleague to get a major grant, internationally comparative work, that effectively established her as an eminent figure in the field. And I think Pam Davis-Keane wouldn't mind me saying pretty much the same about her as well at this point in time. And the role that James had in both influencing me to do that and to do it himself, of course. We got some good papers from this, even though it wasn't my primary interest. And interestingly also, some of the papers I'm showing you, James was not a co-author of. He stepped back from being a co-author of some of these papers. This is the final piece of work I want to talk about. Sorry, I know I've gone over a little bit. One of the most prestigious things you can do in UK academia is to get an ESRC, for a social scientist, is to get an ESRC Research Centre grant. And so I moved to Manchester. I began to work with colleagues in Manchester to develop an idea around getting an ESRC Centre grant. James was not a co-applicant on this. But again, this value of having external collaborators, US-based academics in your network, and being able to ask them to be referees for your application. And of course I asked James, and he was a referee for this application, which centred on inequality, racism, and the position of ethnic minority people in the UK. Again, an incredibly difficult space to get funding for. We wrote, of course, a very nice proposal. We got a lot of support from peer reviewers who gave us suggestions on how to improve the proposal. But the crucial thing was what the referees said to the funding committee. And I don't know whether James was, something I didn't say about James, I don't know whether James was a funder, was a referee. We asked him to be one. Reading what the referees said, I suspect he probably was. James never said, I did that for you. He never said to me, I did that for you. Not this, or the other things that I've mentioned. He would do these things, you kind of know he was doing these things, but he wouldn't take any credit for doing those. You can see some echoes of James's thinking in this, though. The kind of interdisciplinary team, from economics to anthropology to history, the range of methods that we adopted to try and do this work, and a hugely productive centre that's still going. I'm no longer a director of it, but it's still going. Do I have time to just show some exciting UK context stuff, or are we? I do? Yeah, I could skip it if we don't have time. Just to let you know something about the context of the UK and why it was so important for us to get the support to do this kind of work. This chart shows different measures of the experiences of discrimination, prejudice and racism in the UK over time, going from the 1980s through to 2013. The red line shows whether British people report feeling prejudiced against minorities in the UK. And as you can see, from the 1980s through to 2013, it's pretty flat. This is a time where we've seen huge political change. The Windrush generation, that generation of migrants that came to the UK in the 50s and 60s, the reception they were experiencing in the 1980s, far-right, violent encounters with organisations like the National Front and even more violent organisations like Combat 18, who set about killing, attacking, and so on. The golden years of the 1990s of multiculturalism and this idea that we were all living together happily. The beginnings of the culture wars in the UK, that ethnic minorities were segregated from the population, from the rest of the population, not integrating in the early 2000s. And then, of course, you know about Brexit and how immigration and minorities centred in the campaigning of Brexit. Over that period, there's no change. Or there are changes. You can see that Muslims experience more racism, become more worried about racism. And you can see Irish people become less worried about racism, experience less racism. But generally speaking, there's no change. And it's this that James encouraged me and others to study in some detail. This is my final slide. It's not really a Wordle, but it is words that I personally feel and that my colleagues feel about James's contribution to our work and our encounters with him. James Jackson was not a visibly central figure in our work because that's how he operated with us, but he was a very central figure in our work. Not just me, not just the postdocs that I've mentioned who are now senior members in their own right of academia, but also the wide range of colleagues that he encountered when he visited Manchester, listened to their work, critique their work in his positive, supportive way, and the same in UCL and the same in a number of other places. I didn't say that. He came to Manchester regularly. Tony also came occasionally, regularly as well, maybe. I once tried to convince James that Manchester was better than Paris and he should come to Manchester for summer. He then realised it rained there all the time. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to thank the entire panel. Thank you so much.